But it really is it's a delight and an honor to be joint laborers really in this work. It's so, the adjectives are, fly off the lips. I mean, it's exciting, it's an honor, it's a challenge that sometimes feels like it's going to take everything that you have to try to really reach into the very hearts and souls of our students. And I think that this idea, this vision that Deacon Alex has of formation and through union for the sake of this deep purpose is exactly what I need, certainly. It's I think what we all need. So thank you. The topic was suggested, I think, well, actually the phrase came through Father Mealy, right? The Darkened Times, which is from a book by Hannah Arendt. I can't remember how to space this.
Just to add to that real quick, the other thing was, the reason why this got a lot of traction wasn't just because Father Mealy had suggested it, but also talking with Holly Joy and Gary a lot. We talk a lot about the philosophical dark ages and how people don't understand philosophy anymore. And so when you start talking about Christianity, it assumes certain philosophical understandings that aren't there when you talk with a younger person. And that's really what grabbed a lot of traction for it as well.
Yeah. So the idea, you can see on the first Roman numeral, the Dark Ages, question marks. I mean, we all think of when you hear the phrase Dark Ages, we tend to think, as I'm a historian, so we have a precise vision for numbers. I'm not particularly good at that myself. Which was always a relief to my students when I tell them that I'm not actually good at memorizing dates and names. But we think of the Dark Ages as associated with the period following the collapse of the Roman Empire, and this is the title that's been given in for very particular reasons by an influential group of scholars in the age of what they also called the Enlightenment. Right? So there's this sort of, we lived in the Enlightened Age, they lived in the Dark Ages, right? And I think both of those questions, both of those names can and should be challenged. That is, the Dark Ages probably were not nearly so dark, and the period of the Enlightenment that we are still kind of living out is moved itself into a kind of darkness that we're trying to understand. So, but I like the phrase that Father Mealy suggests, darkened times, because it also makes us realize that it's not pitch black, it's darkened, but it's still, there's still light, and there are varying sources of light coming from the same light, and that's what we're going to try to get at here. But to try to get at this age, and then what it takes to communicate and to have authentic connections and relations with one another in this age requires some unpacking, and that's what we're going to try to think about here. If we're old enough to have lived through different ages ourselves, I'm turning 48 in a few weeks, so I've been thinking about these sorts of things lately. Or if we study the past, or if we've lived in different countries and cultures, or gone from the city to the country, we realize that any age or any place or any culture has its own sorts of ways of connecting that tend to work, and other ways that if you try in one place, it's just not going to easily transfer. And I think that what we're trying to think about here today is what are ways that we can more particularly hone in on our own time so that we have the maximum chance of really trying to convey what it is that we are burdened to convey about the love of God, the life of Christ, the possibility of work through the Spirit. So that's kind of the big idea here. Does that make sense? Okay, on the outline that is in the folder, have this quotation by this social critic who I've written a biography about, one of the most eminent social critics of the last third of the 20th century, a guy named Christopher Lasch, who was taught at the University of Rochester, was best known for a book called The Culture of Narcissism that came out in 1979. It was a national bestseller. It won him an audience with President Carter. And those of you who remember the Carter presidency may remember a particularly nervous and agitated president who gave a speech in 1979 during the summer about the energy crisis that we were in and the threat to oil, and parts of his speech had been lifted from Lash's book, who was that influential. On the other side of influence, that he also got interviewed by People magazine, of all places, for it. So Lash was not a Christian of any kind. He was raised by atheists and became a Marxist in the 1960s. But by the 1970s, he was deeply convinced that the country that he had been born into and the political traditions that he had cherished were under deep threat. And so this book, The Culture of Narcissism, was his attempt to try to get beneath these different tendencies that he thought were turning Americans not just in toward themselves, but weakening them as selves, that we were not the strong, able people in terms of our basic moral commitments that he believed that we had. He saw great slippage taking place. Well, as the years went by, he actually got very friendly toward religion. I would actually say that he was something of a fellow traveler with Christianity. In fact, that the late political philosopher Jean Bethke Elshtain, who was a Lutheran and then a Catholic convert, was a very close friend of Lash's. And Jean Elshtain had very interesting conversations with him that seemed to indicate that he was really on a pilgrimage of this sort. And so toward the end of his life, he writes this book, The True and Only Heaven, Progress and Its Critics, in which he unleashes this description of what I think sounds to me a lot like Darkened Times. I need to get my glasses. Excuse me. So I'm going to read this, and then let's just have a little conversation about whether you think he's onto something, or how this hits you, living today, working with students today. He says, the unexpectedly rigorous business of bringing up children. He was born in 1932, and his children were born from, I think, about 59 to 68. So he was bringing up children through the 1970s. The unexpectedly rigorous business of bringing up children exposed me, as it necessarily exposes almost any parent, to our child-centered society's icy indifference to everything that makes it possible for children to flourish and grow up to be responsible adults. To see the modern world from the point of view of a parent is to see it in the worst possible light. This perspective unmistakably reveals the unwholesomeness, not to put it more strongly, of our way of life. Our obsession with sex, violence, and the pornography of making it. Our addictive dependence on drugs, entertainment, and the evening news. Our impatience with anything that limits our sovereign freedom of choice, especially with the constraints of marital and family ties. Our preference for non-binding commitments, our third-rate educational system, our third-rate morality, our refusal to draw a distinction between right and wrong, and he goes on further after that. Does this hit you as apt? Does this jar any memories or any thoughts loose? Does this seem right to you? Anybody have any reactions or anecdotes?
We did have one counter in high school. So
Yeah, true.
one person said he didn't agree with it. So
Yeah. This is a genuine no, I don't think so, or yeah, I think so.
I think so. I had a conversation with one of my core team members, and they said that they cheated on a test to get the A, and it was totally acceptable. Like that wasn't cheating. Well, they recognized it was cheating, and they didn't see it as sinful or wrong.
Yeah.
The goal was to get the A, and so that was one of my core team members. And I was like, it's just the way they.
It's amazing how hard a case that is come to have to make. That there's something wrong with that kind of thing. It really is.
Yeah, the morality was whatever's good for me is what I have to strive for, and how to get it doesn't matter how.
Yeah, and the system is often looked at as it's self-cynical that anything is justified, for you if you're trying to get through it or by it. Yeah. Interesting. Anybody else have any reactions to that perspective, to this perspective?
I almost see as, when did he write this?
1990, 91.
I almost think it's a little bit worse than that. I think that, all these things that are out there, that he's talking, these negatives that are out there, are really presented now and posed as choice. And so it looks like these are the things that give us freedom and choice and hope in the future. And it's exactly from our perspective as religious people, the exact opposite.
Yeah.
So that's my perspective, but it's actually been completely reshaped and rephrased so that it looks the opposite way.
Yeah, almost like 25 years ago, it would be much more common to find, oh yeah, you're right, as a parent, this is hard. But I kind of think that our perspectives on parenting have shifted in this quarter century, so that we now think, no, this is really, kids have, there's a lot of pitfalls. As I heard my brother-in-law and his wife, his second wife, talking one day about their blended family and the different kinds of choices that their children were making. One of the reactions was, in the face of, I don't remember what it was, out of wedlock pregnancy or just different kinds of issues like that they were dealing with. They said, hey, this is the real world. They have to learn to make adult choices. It's all good, so to speak. And I think that idea of choice has really become a kind of moral dictate. Like, it's better to thrust them into the world as it is, let them make choices, and in the end, things are gonna, turn out okay. I think that's what Lash was anticipating, sort of coming here. Anybody else have any reactions? Well, what strikes me about it is that he himself has this kind of aversion to the society he sees emerging, but he's searching for ways to try to get at it. He's searching for ways to try to convey it to an audience that isn't necessarily, he can't count on them having a kind of traditional Judeo-Christian moral baseline. He can't count on a kind of religious, confessional kind of commonality that he can appeal to. He's trying to convey to the general educated public of Americans a moral stance that by the 1990s had become pretty unpopular. And he's looking for language to do that in. And I think he's kind of, you put, well, why do you think that? I mean, what's wrong with our, okay, so you got a problem with sex, Chris? What's the matter with you? Or is making it really pornography? But he's kind of like calling people to a point of view, but he's not really revealing a kind of basis for it beneath simply a judgment that there's something troubling about this. And he's hoping that people will feel the same way. And he's hoping that, especially talking about parents, he's hoping that parents will recognize, it's not a good idea to have our children, pumping Miley Cyrus into their brains, at age 10, around the clock. There's something wrong with that. Yeah.
I think one of the things is my short time in campus ministry I've realized is the young people are wonderful. They're very philanthropic.
Yeah.
They're very service oriented. They're very concerned about the common good.
Yeah.
They don't understand religion.
Yeah.
They're very spiritual people.
Yeah.
And they embrace a certain spirituality about a lot of different things. But they are missing, as you had said, the Judeo-Christian idea. So I don't, I think some of the challenge in campus ministry is like, what you do is good. It's a religious kind of, mindset. But I'm a good person. I don't really need that constraint to direct me. My moral compass is just fine.
Yeah.
And so I think that the young people have a lot of use for spirituality, and they're very moral or ethical. Actually, maybe not moral, but they're ethical.
Yeah.
And they want to see the equality and the common good in the world, and they want to work for that. But they don't think that it's necessarily as important to find that in, let's just say, Roman Catholicism, or even Christianity in general, but maybe specifically Roman Catholicism. And so how are we going to find a way to say that, quite frankly, the sacraments mean something, going to Mass means something, and the cultic aspects of our faith have an effect in your life is very difficult. And so I don't know, I'll be honest, I have no idea what Chris Lash is really saying here, but I think it's the issue of to make the supernatural relevant to them. I mean, you know, philanthropy, service, they have all that down. They're all about that. It's just now we need to find a way to get them to say coming to Mass means something to them. So I don't know if that's anything to do at all with what Chris Lash is saying.
No, well, that has everything to do with where what I'm trying to get at here. That if we're trying to get past the kind of just a general level of there's something disturbing about this, but without really having a reason to say why, then I think we need to move into the language of Christian language and vocabulary and theology and practices that will give something beneath that, an explanation that enlarges the imagination and that provides also a sense of moral identity. Because this generational shift is really fast. I'm a kind of classic Gen X person with all the, kind of angst about the age and just kind of a spirit that tends to be the kind of post-boomer sense of, okay, we need to regroup. We've been butchered by the aftermath of the 1960s. Life's looking really grim. Let's listen to punk music, or whatever. That's sort of like I don't know. But what I notice about the millennials, that is our college students now, is there really is this kind of like reawakening to service and a kind of spirit of togetherness. And I had an interesting paper last week from a kid who was explaining why the genre of music called pop punk has emerged today, which is really interesting because he's in a band with my son, a pop punk band. So I was really grateful for the paper because my generation would take the original punk, but he was talking about this same spirit that you're getting at of just sort of like, hey, this is music for the people. We're not down on the world. We're just trying to find a way to be, not that we don't realize that things are screwed up. We want to try to do some good. How to get from that mindset into a more distinctively Christian, theological, ecclesiastical, liturgical reality is our big challenge. Absolutely. And by the way, if you haven't read yet, I didn't even think about this for the last group, but there's a sociologist in Notre Dame named Christian Smith, who's written very powerfully rooted in the research that he and his colleagues have done on the spiritual lives of young adults. And Smith was evangelical Protestant, converted to Catholicism maybe 7 or 10 years ago. In fact, has a great little book called 95 Steps Back to Rome or something like that, just sort of parody on Luther's 95 Theses. But he has a book called Souls in Transition, The Spiritual Lives of Today's Emerging Adults. Published by Oxford, and it is powerful. And the term that he comes to describe this orientation or this kind of moral sensibility, he calls moral therapeutic deism. Moral therapeutic deism, which basically means, there's like an awareness that there's such thing as right and wrong, and there's a kind of like, that's the moral part, and there's this deistic sense that there's a God who orchestrates things, and he's a nice God, and he's nice to me, and I try to be nice to him. And then that's the therapeutic part. It really turns out to be not getting much further past my own sense of self and taking the steps that I need to make possible good feelings about myself, and that might mean something. But it's kind of, it provides a really nice way to think about starting, how to move into richer, more consequential directions in our relationships with our students. I think it's a big challenge. Yeah.
I'm just here continuing saying to myself, he's from Geneva, which is, the students who go there have made a clear choice.
Yeah.
That they are thinking in a different way, that they're coming into a different culture. Am I misinterpreting that, or is that all the students?
We do have a majority of students who are from some Christian communion, and I think that in terms of percentage-wise, I think Catholics are our highest percentage. We have a lot of, that's partly because of the, Protestantism's great love of fracturing. But at the same time, the problems that are afflicting us culturally are certainly all over the place in our students' lives, in our lives. And I think that, and we also have, you know, many students who are on all over the place in terms of the spectrum of belief and unbelief. So I teach half of my load, which is about 6 hours a week, in a classroom called Invitation to the Humanities, where we just try to get students into a basic kind of sacramental perspective of reality. And then when you try to do things like this in this direction, you realize that no matter what they may say about their choices, they're foundationally or some fundamental way really shaped by the broader culture. And I think that mission of us ecclesiastically to form Christians is the big challenge of the next, well, forever. But certainly, I think that's what we face. Yeah. So, okay. With all that in view, the second Roman numeral language, judgment, story. One of the things I think we need to do with our students, and what we need to do ourselves who are working with students, is to think carefully and with a sense of commitment about the priority of having good language to address them with, as we try to do this thing of moving them past moral therapeutic deism into something that really has the very root and spirit of Christ himself. I think that one of the things that's happened over the last 200 or 300 years of the modern world is we've had a diminishing of Christian language to try to address reality with, to try to name reality with. And I think that that's afflicted Christians as well as non-Christians, because we're all part of this big common culture that's everywhere and it's hitting us with its language all the time. Driving into any town, you can't help but look at advertisements that, if you stop to think about it, you know that they are debasing the words that they're using. Does anybody want to remember when awesome actually meant something? That was a great word that got stolen right away from us by the constant manipulation of it by advertisers and youth culture, that kind of thing. So that you can't say a word, you can't use a word. Well, what do you use in place of awesome? It's a limited fund, right? So it's not like it's a zero-sum game, like, oh, they took that word, we can't recover it, but it takes having a kind of enriched, a dedication to an enriching vocabulary and language. And by that, I don't mean necessarily vocabulary words, I just mean a kind of deep fluency in Christian thinking and Christian thought to be able to make a case that actually begins to sound appealing. That is, I think there's an art and a craft to what we're talking about here. Just thinking about the power of fluency, I was thinking about this, I don't know when, 5 or 6 years ago, all of a sudden, now I'm a kind of outdoorsy type. If it's summertime, I like to be outside. I don't like to be inside very much. So, but I'm also not a very scientific type. I don't have that kind of mind that breaks things, the physical reality down into parts. But all of a sudden, I got very interested in trees. As if I had lived around trees my whole life, which I have, but had never really noticed them almost. And I was thinking about Gerard Manley Hopkins. I think it was actually maybe reading about Hopkins, the 19th century poet, who had this idea that there exists something called inscape. I don't know, maybe some of you guys know about Hopkins. That there is a spiritual perception that we can be granted that helps us to actually see the spiritual dimensions that actually make possible, or that are behind the physical. This is all part of a sacramental vision, and somehow this clicked in for me. And I got very interested in trees, and I asked my wife, Denise, if she would buy, I started talking about this, and then for my birthday, I didn't ask her, for my birthday she got me a book about Pennsylvania trees. I'm so happy. I'm like a little kid, That's so great. I have, pictures. And I started to ingest this vocabulary, and my brain got the ability to remember more than the maple or the oak, and to try to understand distinctions. But that couldn't happen until I had the vocabulary, until I knew that there was such thing as a bur oak over against a swamp oak, or what a silver maple would look like over against a red maple. And the more I learned the language, the more I could name the trees. And this is the key thing. the vocabulary that made possible the relationship. It may sound funny to have a relationship with trees, but I think it's real. That is, I think that there's a kind of level of relationship that's proper for creatures to have with other parts of creation. It's not the same relationship that we would have with one another, right? But there's a kind of respect, there's a kind of relation. Almost all cultures, in their rudimentary sense, have an awareness of this. We call it animism, or things like this. But they realize that there's some way in which we are interconnected, and that requires a certain appropriate level of respect. Otherwise, you get into, well, if it ain't human, we mow it down, and maybe we do mow down some humans for our sakes, right? Instead, we start with a kind of propriety of respect. So the key point there is that language actually trains the eyes, and it makes possible our ability to scout out what's actually happening. And different kinds of languages can take us to different kinds of places. When I was in high school, my parents moved us to Brazil, and I learned Portuguese pretty well, and my parents lived there a lot longer than I did. And my dad and mom are from Western Pennsylvania. My dad's from Bedford County, which is about 2.5 hours east. My mom's from Johnstown, closer. My dad is kind of a brusque man, classic Appalachian style from his generation. He's 69 years old now. Not given to visible displays of a kind of tenderness, right? But this is what's interesting. Sometime in my 30s, maybe it was my 20s, my dad sent a card to me. Mom and Dad did. It might have been a birthday card. And my dad wrote his part of the card in Portuguese. And it was very, very tender. Depois, quando a gente fala português, uma língua bonita, uma língua que traz a gente num lugar que onde que possamos ser íntimos. You can just tell without knowing what I said, that I said something that sounded very soft, and that's the way Brazilians speak. Immersed in the language with the people, he became something that he was not. That only happened through the language. That wouldn't have happened if he had just sort of gone there and, like, I see you, but I'm not hearing you. It took, actually, the language prepared him to become somebody that he was not. So different languages have different kinds of gifts to offer. Now, if we think about theology as a language, and not just sort of like a system, like in the tradition I was raised in, of kind of dogmatic points, right? A very kind of classically Protestant, cognitive-oriented thing, right? But as something that takes us, that is a language that we learn to speak, a language that we learn to feel through, a language we learn to see through, then I think it gives us a very different perspective on how it is that we can, how it is that we might enrich ourselves to become better equipped to draw near to the students that we're working with, in the same way that my father was able to draw nearer to me because he had become adept in this other language. My concern is that when we try to take the riches of Christian faith and Christian thinking into our students, but we primarily use the language of mainstream American culture, pop culture, whatever, that there's something that we're not going to be able to convey through this. So in order to get deeply into the kind of relationship that will make possible a really full and compelling explanation of what currently students are having a hard time grasping, then I think we need to have this kind of enrichment. So is the outline the same as last time?
Yeah.
Yeah. So at the top of the second page, it may be just worth pointing out this, that if we're trying to get at the issue of darkened times, to the extent that we think they are darkened times, and I'll just stop and say this for a minute. I think there are plenty of ways in which we've gained light in the last few hundred years. And I think that most of us would agree with that. Even though we might disagree or agree with one another on whether we think it's been a net gain or net loss. All those questions are interesting and important. I think that all of us would probably say there have been some things that we've made great gains in, and those gains are the ones, I'll just kind of briefly say this and then have to move on, but have to do with the gains that are associated with the liberal tradition. The liberal tradition has been about liberating human beings from oppression, and we have had genuine liberation of human beings from oppression. And so we've had powerful examples of people gaining insight about the nature of human dignity because we've had these advances in things that you know, against racism or different kinds of oppression. Red Barber was the Brooklyn Dodgers and later Los Angeles Dodgers play-by-play announcer and all through the 1940s and 50s. And then in the 60s, 70s. And in an interview on Ken Burns' baseball documentary that came out about 20 years ago, they had this fantastic interview with Red Barber where he says, this is about Jackie Robinson coming into the majors as the first African-American player. And Red Barber was from the South. How a guy from the South ends up being the play-by-play announcer in Brooklyn is an interesting question. He has this beautiful Southern accent. And he's saying how that, looking back on it, he could see that even though he resisted at the time, the embrace that he witnessed whites giving to Jackie Robinson and Roy Campanella and other African-American athletes that came along was so powerful to him that it actually helped him, and this is his word, to mature. Because he became somebody who was able to overcome this way of life that had stunted his growth as a human being. So we live in darker times. The trick is to try to figure out how to sort through these gains and losses to present the compelling picture of what's actually happening, right? The stories that we are competing with in terms of trying to etch out a Christian eschatology are pretty powerful. And I think we have to be aware of what those stories are, right? One of the dominant stories is the story of progress. That what's been true in race relations has actually been true for everything. That everything has gotten better. It's not just race relations or not just things that are human rights or whatever. It's the whole civilization has gotten better. So this is kind of like a liberal story of romance. Right? It's a romantic vision. There's music playing in the background that makes your heart melt. You know where it's going to end. You know, there's the kind of inverse picture of that is also strangely enough very common, and that is apocalypse. Anybody seen any post-apocalyptic films? It's like it's like almost like a balance between one and the other. You know, it's like you get one and you have to subject yourself to the other one. And I tend to actually enjoy watching it myself. But there's a kind of cataclysmic vision. And I kind of think the one asks for the other. Just like we know that it's not total progress, I think we also know that somehow it's probably not going to be completely apocalyptic, but we don't know how to live in that tension. So you have this kind of tragic story of the very things that have made us progress in civilization, science, and technology are also going to kill us off. But in the apocalyptic story that we're so used to, in most of them, there is no one, capital N, capital O, watching out for us. There are a few where that shows up. The Children of Men is my favorite about this, which is a very beautiful story. There's a big story of the age that kind of says that posits stasis. Nothing really changes. I mean, you can invent the latest machine, the latest digital revolution. You can change marriage definitions. You can change sexual mores. Nothing really changes. People are the way they are. People are the way, you know. And I think that's kind of, that's the old ancient Greek cyclical vision of reality. Each of these stories probably has something about them that we can affirm, right? The trick is to become fluent enough in our own story with our own language to be able to put out a more compelling story that makes sense of these kinds of wide-ranging impulses, right? Chesterton in Orthodoxy has a great line that I one year I had on my door, kind of like my office door. says, which I will not at all be able to remember at the moment. Okay, he says, there is a huge and heroic sanity of which moderns can only collect the fragments. There is a huge and heroic sanity of which moderns can only collect the fragments. And by that, I think he has this idea that sanity has to do with health, right? Salud. And that there is this healthfulness that is made possible through a submission to God. But when you don't begin from within Christian faith, then you have the fragments of this health. And so we see patches of it here and patches of it there, and we seize on the one thing. So we might think like, yes, service to the poor, this is really great, without having to worry over here at all about my own personal morality or any sense of law, whether natural or revealed, whatever the thing is. We just kind of have these fragments of the Christian vision, and that's what Chesterton says the story of the modern age is. The story of the modern age for him is not that there's all this bad stuff happening, it's all this good stuff that's run off in different directions without being collected together, without being gathered together. And to be able to put these fragments together into a common story, a compelling story that we can tell that has this kind of depth and richness, I think is a thing that, that is where the challenge lies. So in search of truer languages and truer stories, I think there's a few directions to go, and I can't stop thinking that catechesis is somehow at the heart of this. And it's something that we often associate with childhood, rightly, right? But I think that it is the ongoing need of the age, and I think what we need to do is get more creative with how we do it and go about this throughout the whole lifespan. I'm not that there's a point when catechesis takes different forms. I was just saying this at lunch the other day. When people find out you're a historian, they ask you things like, what's your favorite period? And I never have a good answer for that. But the other question that I have had some answers that totally, throw people off is, if you could go back in history, what would you go back to? And one of my moments that I had to go back to is the moment in the 13th century when Thomas Aquinas decided that he was going to stop writing theology. Thomas Aquinas, 1224 to 1275, this enormous output in which he had secretaries lined up, across his office, and he would dictate to them, start here, go there, and just kind of working through this. And at some point, he has an epiphany and says, everything that I've written is strong. There's nothing more to do. So apparently, his own need for catechesis had moved into a very different level at some point. But I think that there's a sense in which I think an expansive understanding of what catechesis means. I think this is so crucial because it trains us, again, just like language, to see what is actually happening. And this is the most powerful story I have, personal story I have of this. We were teaching our oldest son the catechism, and he was, I think, 3 at the time. And there was one afternoon in our house, I was in grad school. Frankly, it was not the smoothest moment in the history of marriage. And Ian's mother and I were having a really good time showing that it wasn't the best of moments in our marriage. And Ian was we were in my study, and Ian was kind of playing around on the floor, and he heard us yelling back and forth. And there was a break in the action, and he looks up at us. I can still picture him next to my bookshelf. He looks up at us, and he says, God is everywhere. That's an answer to his question. And that was the answer he needed in a moment of stress. And I think, seeing the way he's developed, I think he also meant that as a gift to us, to help his mom and dad. That's the power of catechesis. By committing ourselves to this, it teaches us to see what's happening, and I think it provides occasion and opening for the Spirit to show us things, because we become so immersed in the language and the logic, right, of what's happening, that we have eyes to see, right? It's for him who has eyes to see, let him see, ears to hear, let him hear. So that's one part of this. Then there's the trick of getting from the language itself into a kind of enriched means of expression. That is, how do I become somebody who's capable of actually delivering this in a way that's compelling, authentic, that does justice to the majesty that surrounds us. You know, God obviously took great pains not to be utilitarian in his aesthetic. There is something utterly compelling, so much so that, as Paul says in Romans 1, what actually we find ourselves having to do is shield ourselves from nature to get away from the voice of God. They are without excuse, because the divine attributes of God have been clearly seen, Paul says in Romans 1. So we need to become people who, like God, have given ourselves over to a kind of expression that can manifest this in its depth. And so I think we need to seek enrichment of this. Now, so this is according to our gifts, and we each have gifts that will help us to do this in particular ways. But I think that we can spend time with people who can help us to get at this well. Terrence Malick's film, The Tree of Life, I think for me has been the most powerful representation in film lately that helps to open up questions. And Malick, I'm not sure that he has any kind of Christian commitment or confession, but he certainly spent a lot of time thinking about it. You can't watch the film without realizing that. Chris Chapman, what's his position? What's Chris's position?
His
It
position?
changes every other week.
It's like secondary elementary catechesis.
Okay, there you go. So Chris was telling me about another film that he's seen. Are you talking about me about? What's that?
Was it Calvary?
Calvary, yeah, where he was saying that this really affected. I think that these people, like Malick, these different film directors, can help us to think about how to imagine what's happening and give us some ideas to go with, and also pathways to move others toward. Christian Wyman is an interesting poet. He's at Yale Divinity School. Recently, he was probably the leading young poet of his generation in the 1990s, and had been raised in some kind of a Christian family in Texas. Went to college and just chucked it within weeks, he says. He showed up and just, that was it. You know, he was gone. He set his sights on becoming a world-class poet, and did it, amazingly enough. And then his life just fell apart in his mid-30s, dried up in terms of writing poetry, but fell in love, finally, and through this came back to the possibility that there might be this good God. And then he was diagnosed with cancer at age 39, and found himself rushing back to church with his then wife, and has been on this pilgrimage and writing powerfully in the Atlantic about his reemergence as a religious believer. I think, I'm not sure where he's ended up, if he has, in terms of denominational affiliation. But he's written some poetry that can help us to think about and expand our sense of what's possible. This is one of his recent books, Every Written Thing. Charles Taylor, probably the leading, certainly one of the leading philosophers of our age, Canadian Catholic, has written a powerful book that people have commented on all across the kind of academic divisions and religious divisions, called A Secular Age. It's hundreds of pages long. It's like 800 or 900 pages long. I haven't read it, but it's the kind of book that's so powerful that people have been forced to engage it. And this is a beautiful thing. It's also spawned its own kind of industry of books commenting on it. And these can be really helpful for those of us who don't have time to read through 900 pages of Charles Taylor. How Not to Be Secular, Reading Charles Taylor by a philosopher named James K.A. Smith, published by Erdman's Publishing Company, a religious publishing house. It also published my book on Christopher Lasch. And And Smith's book is just an example of the kinds of things that we have access to from the various religious publishing houses that can help us, can meet us where we are in terms of our own possibilities and intellectual development. So I think what I'm trying to suggest here is that there are just ways that we can pursue enrichment with the end of becoming more persuasive, more convincing, more faithful witnesses. But before we stop here at this portion, I think it would be really remiss to not say that this is not just a cognitive thing, right? That learning language can just be rote, or catechesis, or knowledge can in fact puff up, as St. Paul says, right? But through koinonia, that is fellowship, and through witness, we can find our hearts opened up to be able to receive language more fully, right? There's a thesis by a historian of Christian mission named Andrew Laws, I believe a Scottish historian, who makes an interesting case that the academic disciplines like linguistics and psychology and sociology and anthropology were actually pioneered by Christian missionaries who, because they put themselves on the front lines of unbelief, realized that there were things about reality that they needed to understand in a more sophisticated way to be able to reach the people. And so the modern academic disciplines were partly born not because people were trying to attack Christian faith, which is kind of the usual story that we learn, but because they were trying to actually deepen our understanding of the gospel by studying more intently on things like language or human psychology or human communities, that's studying sociology. So as we engage in outreach with a real desire, a passion, a burden to take life into the midst of people who are dying, right? To expose to a culture of death, a true culture of life, it forces us into a kind of cognitive, intellectual dimension as we try to understand how it is that we can make these contacts. So as that happens, I think our spirits are open, our hearts are open, and then we have ears to hear the language that God's speaking to us. All right, so I think am I right, Deacon Alex, that we're going to stop at 2:30?
Yeah, and take a break for, I think, 15 minutes and come back for discussion.
Yeah, so we can talk about this during break, or we'll have some discussion, and we'll follow this up. And what I want to do when we get into discussion is I think that if there's one area that Americans and college students in particular are still alive to that has possibilities for making a bridge into a kind of Christian way of thinking about things, it's the notion of freedom. I think freedom is something that we still care about in deep ways, and we still understand ourselves. We pride ourselves as Americans as being people who care about the reality of freedom, and I think that gives us enormous possibilities in terms of making connection. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Our plan is to move into some discussion till about 3:30. And I'm going to set up this issue of freedom and the question of darkness and light, kind of the notion of freedom. And then Deacon Alex is going to lead us direct us towards some discussion of these ideas. But here's the if you think about what we spent the last part talking about language, what I'm thinking of this next section is is to give us a kind of concrete example of a way that we might think about student life, our everyday lives in the broad American world in view of a particular concern that we share as Christians and as people who are not associated with any faith, and that is this notion of freedom. So just to try to, as Deacon Alex and I were talking through this idea for this session in the preceding weeks, we were thinking a lot about this basic idea that that the kind of language, that it's very hard to talk about particular issues without having language with which to address it. So that explains all that, we spent this past hour talking about. But I think that this, to try to grasp what's really going on, there's two things to kind of quickly turn to that might help us to put together what's going on with freedom in this bigger context. The literary scholar Roger Lundeen, in his book From Nature to Experience, the American Search for Cultural Authority, I'm under Roman numeral 3 and point A, I think that is on the outline. Page 2. Lundeen says this, that for countless centuries, men and women had believed themselves called to reconcile their inner lives with higher purposes beyond themselves. Now at last, that is by the 19th century, they no longer needed to trouble themselves with trying to bring their longings as subjects in line with the meaning of objects, which is to say that the only thing that has meaning by the time we get into the 19th century is me. That there isn't a quest beyond myself into some sort of sphere that I have to align myself to. And his sense is that this is what has been understood as the kind of fundamental, rudimentary, primordial religious quest of all peoples anywhere, is the sense that whatever I am is not enough, and it has to be connected to something beyond myself. And hence all the different religious rites of devotion and atonement that we see, whether you're in Asia or South America or wherever it is, there's this sense that the self, the me, for one thing, doesn't even exist. To a lot of you, Alistair McIntyre, the great philosopher, says that the individual is a modern invention. So people have had this intuitive understanding that they needed to connect to something beyond themselves to somehow make things right, to get alignment, to have experience like this. What Lundeen is saying is that that's dropped off the map. That what's out there is just stuff. It's just objects. It's objective. We can use it, we can do with it what we want, and there are no consequences because that's not the way things are laid out. That's a powerful story. Now that might help us to think about what it means to live in a darkened time, right? In a darkened age, is that that basic illuminating insight that that St. Augustine said, I did not know that I did not know that I needed to be lighted with light beyond myself. Instead he says, you will light my way, O Lord, in the Confessions. That sort of becomes harder and harder to feel, right? And that's a diminishing of light. Right? So that's just one way to think about it. Alistair McIntyre, who taught at Notre Dame for many years, in this book that was probably before Taylor's book on the secular age, the book by a Christian scholar that has most affected academic disciplines in the 20th century, whether within the Christian world or not. In his book, After Virtue, that came out in 1981 and in several editions since then, he says that his metaphor is that what's happened in the West is there's been a cataclysm that's taken place that has exploded our ability to think properly about anything that has to do with morality, much less metaphysics. He says we have vestiges of the old language that that talked about things like justice or virtue, but we don't really know what it means. He says it's if there was like a nuclear attack that had destroyed our technological know-how, and we have these little objects around that we don't know how to put together. Right? We have shards here and fragments of machinery. But we don't have the understanding where to put it all together. That's the world, he says, that we live in morally. And that gives some explanation to why some people would call it a darkened age, right? But in the midst of all this, whatever it needs to be, and I also add this again, I think that because we do have to focus on the subject, on the individual self, I think we've had gains also in terms of individual self. I think we understand, there's some ways in which we understand individuality and subjectivity in ways that may be better than people did, say, in 1600. I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure I'd go to the mat on that, but my perception is that may be true. That's what Charles Taylor argues, at least. So I think that one of the powerful visions and notions coming out of the Christian era into this, that has helped to make possible our world, is this notion of freedom, right? A land of liberty. One of the historians of the American Revolution wrote a book, a guy named Nathan Hatch, who actually taught at Allegheny, is now president of Wake Forest. Hatch, in his book called The Sacred Cause of Freedom, shows all the different ways that the ministers throughout the American Revolution were appealing on theological grounds and on classical Republican grounds to this vision of freedom that was about aligning the self with the reality beyond me. That's what made freedom possible. And this still has a punch, the vision of freedom, but what it actually means has kind of devolved into something that feels considerably more narrow today. And if you look back to the last quote at the beginning, I think that it's an interesting question, what he's saying about freedom, and that's why I have parts of it underlined from the first page. He says, our society's icy indifference, in the second line, to everything that makes it possible for children to flourish and to grow up to be responsible adults. That is, parents have a hard time having the freedom to help their children to become what they're made to become. That's a challenge to our freedom. And yet at the same time, the next underlined phrase, he's protesting our sovereign freedom of choice. So you have these kind of dueling notions of freedom. How do we put these together? Is he saying that we have too much freedom? Is he saying that we have not enough freedom? Yeah, he's saying both. We have too much freedom of choice, but we also have not enough freedom as parents to help our children become. So we have these tensions, and I think these struggles then give us opportunity to raise important questions. So if it's true that the land of the free has become a tough place for those seeking freedom in some ways, it may be possible in the midst of our pluralism to introduce some thinking about freedom that will help us to shed some light and maybe win students or parishioners or ourselves to more secure, to more sure ground and to more insight. Christians, or Isaiah Berlin is a secular political philosopher who made the distinction between positive freedom and negative freedom. Where positive freedom gives me the freedom to do something, the freedom for something, and negative freedom gives me freedom from something. So freedom from oppression, so that I might be able to realize my calling as a human being, or think about that. But there's this tension. Do we want to stress negative freedom without positive freedom? That seems to be the kind of direction that we've taken. That our as a nation, we think there's a lot of we need to be free from particular things. We don't really like to set out an agenda of what you should be free to do, except to make sure that you're not somebody who keeps other people back. So the positive freedom becomes making sure that negative freedom is possible, or something like that. If you want to strike out a vision for positive freedom, you fundamentally get into worldview questions, and that gets into discussions that may prove fruitful for us. In a more Christian vein, the second bullet point there, we might clarify this by pointing out that freedom as license to do whatever you want isn't really freedom, right? That freedom actually involves submission. And license is a great old-fashioned word that doesn't fall trippingly off the tongue anymore in this sense. If you say freedom as license, people might say, what do you mean? I mean, to be a human being is to have license. No. Right? To have license in this sense can lead us into all kinds of thickets that we would rather not be in. So to introduce this powerful idea that I am most free when I am in submission to my Creator provides some possibilities. And yet we have a burden almost to protect this vision of license. I've read this great story by a counselor, Christian counselor, who was counseling a woman in her 30s who felt like her life was falling apart, just a wreck. She was depressed, exhausted, didn't know what to do with herself, and needed some help to put herself back together. And so he started to talk to her. So tell me about your life. How you know, what do you do? And she talks about the job that she has, and then the partying on the weekend. You know, drinks a lot and has a lot of sex and you know, and drugs, experimentation with all kinds of different things like that. And then he listens to her for a while, and he says, well, have you considered stopping those kinds of activities? And her response was classic. Do you mean I don't have to? You mean I don't have to live like that? That is my experience working with college students, is that is exactly what they feel like coming out of high school for most of them. That they have to, because that's what the good life is. Right? The good life is taking full advantage of pleasure wherever you can find it. And most immediately, the pleasure that has to do with your body. And to forsake that is to abandon something that feels like a betrayal of a way of life, which is to say it's become part of a cultural identity, right? So freedom, we can introduce this notion of license, or whatever that means, but maybe that's not the pathway to health, right? Maybe that's not the pathway to inner peace or to an integrated personality, or whatever the vision of well-being is that we have on offer. But maybe it has something to do with reconstructing a cosmological framework in which we're made to live and participate. You know, when I was in my early 20s, and I had gone through a profound religious crisis of faith. Nothing hit me more powerfully than the language of St. Paul in Athens to the Greek philosophers, when he quoted back to them their phrase, "In him we live and move and have our being." That was an anchor to my soul. That was what I needed to know and to begin to ingest and understand. In him we live and move and have our being. That is, I don't have to live my life in existential crisis. I don't have to be a subject who is alienated, disaffected. Right? That there is a sense of, there's a participatory reality that I'm part of, and in that is freedom. That's what freedom means. The freedom isn't my sort of declaration of the sovereign self, right? Which is what all of us are inclined to feel who drink deeply of American culture, modern culture. That's not the declaration I need to make, right? The declaration I need to make is that I'm part of something, but I need help becoming part of something, right? That my precise problem is that I don't know how to be part of something, right? That I'm not connected, that I need the tentacles of life themselves to be reached out to me. And maybe submission isn't the best word now to describe that, right? I mean, maybe submission reeks too much of an old world of autocracy and bondage and things like that, but we need to find ways to get at that. Does that make sense? Also struck by this disparity that we feel when we try to think about political freedom versus spiritual freedom, right? And this is a tricky one, because political freedom has to do with all of us honoring the dignity of one another, and all the debates right now and the fights about marriage and gay marriage and all these, daily the updates on what's happening puts us in a tricky position. And many of us have gay and lesbian members of our families. I do. And there is something really crucial about honoring dignity that has to do with political freedom, and it puts us in a tricky position when we try to think about law, civil law, right? But I think whatever it is, we need to honor the insight that political freedom has to do with protecting the dignity of the human being, and then looking to our deepest sources of wisdom to try to figure out what the heck that means in terms of things like politics, right? Spiritual freedom, I take to mean is the idea that because of spiritual freedom, I can be free no matter what the political system is around me, right? If I'm persecuted in China and I get thrown into prison as a Christian, I can still be spiritually free. Or Solzhenitsyn's great book, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, where he has Alyosha, this Russian Christian, kind of bearing witness of the fact that he can be free in the gulag. So how do we honor the idea of spiritual freedom, fight for political freedom, cast a vision of what Christian freedom is, and do so in a way that's winsome and best for our times? I think these are really live questions, and I'm very grateful that really intelligent, smart, wise, learned people are working on, and we all have access to. For instance, what's happening right now in the Extraordinary Synod, as we were talking about during break, where there's very wise and learned people trying to think carefully about nitty-gritty questions of how to speak about these things, let alone how to think about laws in response to these things. We don't have to worry about the laws. We don't have to be sidetracked into those kinds of debates. Now, maybe we should, because maybe students will require that of us. So what do you think of gay marriage and why? But I think we need to be able to, more importantly than that, be alert to the concerns that are noble within questions about freedom, and then to have the acuity and the wisdom to move our relationships in a direction that shed light. So I think there are genuine problems that we face, but I think there's a genuine promise associated with it, that we preserve this concern about freedom, and I think it gives us a chance to have discussions. And maybe it's helpful to conclude with this basic point, which I kind of have written out there in a paragraph at the bottom of page 2. But that is that the whole issue of freedom has to do with what it means to be human. And that's powerful, to think that we can still talk about human being as if there's a way to talk about it besides just giving people the choice to do whatever they want to do. Right? If we can, and maybe humanity, just the notion of humanity is something else that we can use, that we can develop with our students. What does it mean to be human? Arise, shine, for your light has come, Isaiah 60. Right? The age may be darkened, but the light has come. Light shines in darkness, and the darkness could not overpower it, from the prologue of St. John. So there's this sense in which the light is there, the light is here, the light is all around us. And yet I'm struck by the words of Christ in Matthew 5, in which he says, in the same way, your light must shine in people's sight, so that seeing your good works, they may give praise to your Father in heaven. That is, even though the light has come, we still bear the responsibility to shine light. And if we fail to do that, it increases the darkness. That's the metaphor of the bushel. So we can thank God that the light has come, but we also must dedicate ourselves to shining the light by our own service to God. So with that in mind, Deacon Alice is going to take us into some questions.
Discussion
questions, and maybe try to tie things
Can I
up.
borrow that one?
Yeah.
So there's a lot to kind of ingest in that, a lot of different things to talk about, and we don't have to follow all these questions, but on the last sheet you saw there that there were 4 questions, and we can kind of just break this open and talk about whatever it is that you want to talk about within some of these questions. As campus ministers, how do you see freedom and the understanding of freedom in your ministry with your students, and how can we take some things away from this talk, try to guide that to be effective in our ministry where we are? What are some of the things you're seeing with your young people with regards to what we've been talking about?
I work with the students. I have this phrase: Are you afraid to lose yourself, or are you trying to find yourself? In this notion of freedom, of finding your identity in Christ. And so I think so many people are trying not to lose themselves, and so that stops them from trying to find Christ. So there's no freedom in that. So are you trying not to lose yourself, or are you really trying to find who you are, find yourself?
Interesting. I think like the book of Genesis, when God says to Adam, "Where are you?" It's not like he's God, so like he obviously knows where Adam is spatially, right? So it's more existential. Where are you? Are you trying to be lost, or are you trying to be found? So what is it that they're trying to lose themselves to?
Well, the part of emptying, the kenosis part of emptying yourself means, am I going to lose myself in the process? Like coming to know Christ, I have an identity, but if I come to know Him religiously, then will I lose myself in the process? So like I know myself as an athlete, I know myself as a friend, but I don't know myself as a Christian.
So you're afraid to lose yourself. So you lose yourself so you can't be found, right? From kind of playing, what you're saying is, I don't want to be found because I don't want to lose myself. So I'll rather than to be found, I'll lose myself to myself.
Yeah, it's a conundrum. What do you do? Like, if to try to find myself, I might lose myself in the process, which is unfair.
So where is this impinging upon the gospel then? Selfism. How is it impinging upon the proclamation of the gospel? You're trying to get young people to embrace the gospel, to embrace Christianity. How do you address this issue with your young people? Could be catechesis, like Dr. Miller was talking about. Catechesis is important.
The language between happiness and joy, they use them, young people use it synonymously, but there's a difference between joy and a fleeting happiness, and so, how do you...
So this doesn't become the Father Zavich and Deacon Alex show here. Not that you're bringing it, you're pushing it forward. I really appreciate that, Mike. But let's see, what's joy? You're a Christian. What is joy?
I put it in terms of joy is spiritual, happiness is emotional, and pleasure is physical. And they don't all mean the same thing.
So joy
is spiritual,
happy,
happiness is emotional,
physical,
pleasure is physical. Which one do you have?
is it one or the other?
No.
Well, just maybe, I don't know if this would be applicable to the students that are here today, but I think one of the things that's probably most attractive to their club on campus here, Catholic club on campus here, is probably just simply love. I think, they find friendship, fraternity, a social environment that goes deeper than any other friendship and relationship with most people on campus that they have. And I think it's love that draws them together here more than anything else, and the freedom to experience that within the Christian underpinnings that they grew up with.
So,
is that fair?
Oh, it's definitely fair.
Well, I was asking them first. So in terms of selfism, it comes out of relationship and that desire for what we all seek in any real relationship is love.
So, is it fair to say they're looking for love in all the wrong places?
No, I think they're finding the right kind of love in the right place, and that's what's
For you.
attractive.
Yes.
And that's what's attractive,
Okay.
eternally attractive.
I think we were saying the same thing, different side of the coin. I was selfism, when someone's being selfish, losing themselves, they're looking for a relationship, which is counterfeit to the deeper love that they're encountering here. Right?
Yeah, you said, what's our response to selfism? I'm saying, so what's
that
attractive,
love.
what they're finding here is
Okay.
that real love.
Okay, so love, good.
Maria, she had something here she wrote down.
We don't accept ourselves as a whole. We accept the side that we want people to see, and not the broken parts of us, the flaws in us.
So help me out with that.
We as human beings show off what we want people to see. We have a tendency to not let people in, to let them see what it is we don't like about ourselves, all our flaws.
Okay, good. And so what the faith does, or what the community does, is it allows I'm reading into this right now, it allows a place for that vulnerability to be authentic,
Yes.
where you can be yourself. Okay, so yeah, we have the Facebook identity, right? You know, it's happy, everything's good. I always love Facebook, right? Because you like some tragedy that's on a, you know, like. It makes no sense. Can't we just like say don't like? You know, I don't know, it's just kind of weird.
I think, yeah, just to kind of dovetail off that, and we were speaking about the synod in the break, and you know that really the bishops are looking at, you know, at least for the last day or two, we're looking at how are we, what is the language as we in the discussion that we use, and I think that, you know, it's okay to come to the church flawed. It's okay to come to the church with your struggle. It's okay to come to the church and ask questions. And especially on a college campus and in a Newman Center, the students should feel that they can come to us and not be, as you're saying, the perfect Catholic. That's okay. I mean, we can try to talk to you, try to bring you to another place. We're not going to condone what the church doesn't teach. That's not what the bishops in Rome are saying now. But we need, Cardinal Casper just wrote a book on mercy. We need to invite in these kids that are struggling with their identity, with their Catholicism, even with their morality, and that's okay. They need to see in the Newman Center a place of compassion, a place of understanding and dialogue, a place where they can share ideas and not feel they're going to be judged. And it all has to do, I think, with the presentation of it. So many young people say, you know, Pope Francis is so wonderful. I've come back into the church because of Pope Francis, as if Pope Benedict was like this, you know, horrible, real jerk. Pope Benedict was a very loving Holy Father. But the image of Francis has attracted the young people. And I think with the Newman Center, you need to, it's not it's not to paraphrase Francis, it's not a museum of saints, it's a hospital for sinners. And we need in a college campus in a Newman Center to invite those people in. Maybe they're not going to Mass every week, maybe they're not perfectly living the Christian life. We welcome you still. And that's something that somehow we have got to get out there on the college campus and invite them in. I just think that the language and the presentation and the way that we go about that can be very effective and important. And our mission as Newman Centers on college campuses.
Very good, thank you,
Can I
Father.
speak to that?
Yes.
Briefly?
Yes.
No, I think you're very much onto something. But we're also dealing with a history of perception too. You know, we have a Newman Center here, it's been here for decades, everybody knows it. And we actually, this last February, we offered a theology on tap-like thing at the brewery. And we specifically said, this is we're Catholic, but we're very welcoming to non-Catholic Christians. And we're going to talk about Christian ideas and Christian themes. And just rephrasing that and repositioning that, more Catholics wanted to come because they felt I could be a stupid Catholic.
Exactly.
You know, at this non-Catholic place,
Exactly.
at this non-Catholic conversation, I can be a stupid Catholic and ask what I think are dumb questions.
How did you word that again? When you advertised it?
Oh, stupid Galatians was in the reading today.
I love the first reading of it.
No, what did you
When
say?
you advertised it, how did you market it? How did you brand it?
Well, the venue was at the brewery, so we took it away from the Newman Center, parish center here, and we also specifically said it's got a Catholic foundation, but it's going to be very welcoming and open to non-Catholic Christians. We didn't get all that many non-Catholic Christians, but we got a lot of Catholics, at least initially.
Because they felt safe.
Yeah, felt safe in being not very Catholic.
So I think this is a really interesting point. So the Newman Center needs to be a place of mercy, compassion, a place of dialogue, a place where people can let their guard down, where they can be authentically themselves, where they can be vulnerable, where they can ask questions.